Okay, good morning.
Hello, nice to see you, Gina.
Hi, this is Dr. Gina Griffin, and we are here with another episode for Adventures in Social Work Research, but specifically rigorously relevant, which is kind of my own brand of talk show. I always wanted my own talk show, so this is how I got it.
I love it.
Yeah, me and Oprah. So if Oprah wanted to talk about social work research. So on rigorously relevant, that is what we talk about. We try to lift social work research and inspire others to do more research in the social work field, and that's why we're here. So today I have Dr. Melanie Sage, who is awesome, and I would love for her to tell you a little bit about herself before we really get rolling.
I guess my first question for you is, do I pay you now or later for the awesome part? We'll work it out at the end.
You get
I am.
It's my favorite word, and I can't stop saying it. Go on.
I'm an assistant professor at the University at Buffalo School of Social Work up here in Buffalo, New York. I study child welfare in the intersection of child welfare and technology specifically. Before I came here to this role, I was at the University of North Dakota, and I actually earned promotion and tenure there just as I was on my way out the door. But I went to a school where I got to experience it all again because I love that pressure of working on tenure so much that I wanted to replicate it. So I got my PhD in social work and research at the university, at Portland State University in 2010. And before that, I had about 10 years of practice experience.
That is amazing. And I knew a little bit of that, but there's a lot of that I didn't know. So that was really interesting. So, let's go back a little further than that. How did you wind up as a social worker from the beginning?
Yeah, from the very beginning. When I was a teenager, my mom was a child welfare worker, and she was a late starter in working on her degrees. So she got her degree in psychology when I was about 16, 17, and I was already mostly off on my own things, but my mom and I had always been really close. And so I was just like really confused by why she would come home and talk about how she liked her clients and they liked her. I'm like, you're working with parents who like abuse their children or neglected their children, and you should be like setting limits with them and telling them how wrong they are. They shouldn't like you, you know. So I was kind of flummoxed by this whole idea that one's clients in that field would like them, and so she would tell me stories, you know, of what people had gone through and how they kind of ended up in their situation, and so I started college at the community college when I was about 17. And I had the opportunity to do an internship, and she helped me get an internship at the Child Welfare Agency. And so I started, you know, working out there, supervising visits, you know, pretty low key stuff. But I saw like that these parents really loved their kids, and it's all a little more complicated. And so like, you know, as our adolescent brains are forming and we're delving into the like, not everything is black and white. That's one thing that really helped me figure this out. And I was like, okay, I'm going to follow your path. I'm going to be a child welfare worker. And so I'll get my master's in psychology like you. And she said, don't do that. Get your master's in social work. It's a better degree. It's you've got more options in terms of where you head after the degree, and it does a better job at thinking about those gray areas. Like it's not all about kind of brain and individual perspectives, but it's a lot about environments, and it's complicated. And social work does a better job of it's complicated. And so I said, okay, social work it is.
That's such a great answer. It sounds like she was very inspirational, and it must have been really nice having her as a role model.
Yeah, she's amazing. And I would say like she lived social work values in her life, and maybe not the boundaries part so much because she went maybe the extra mile for everybody in her life. But yeah.
Great. Okay, so then what pointed you in the direction of research once you got embroiled in the world of social work?
It was completely an accident. Like, I never wanted to be a researcher. Like, there are not too many practitioners who go like, I want to be a researcher when I grow up. And you're one of the exceptions, maybe. But you know, so I did child welfare work for several years. I kind of moved up through the child welfare ranks fairly quickly. I moved from being like a practitioner to a trainer and kind of supervision roles. And the next step, as I was thinking about where do I go from here, was either to be kind of supervisor manager, or, you know, the other option in the back of my head, like, well, what does one do when they're kind of moving up the ranks and need more knowledge? You go and get another degree, right? And I was like, you know, I say like first gen college student, because by the time my mom went to college, I was so like socially disconnected from her in terms of like following her path, or she never was in a place to give me like wisdom about about what it's like to go to college, because she was basically doing it at the same time as me, you know. So technically, you know, I just wasn't raised with that, like, people go to college, and I never really spent a lot of time with people who went to college. So I didn't even know like people went away to college, or like you just go to the college that's closest to you. That makes a lot of sense, right? And so I really didn't know anybody who had ever gotten a PhD when I was growing up. And so I was just like, well, I need to go back to school to learn some more stuff, because I don't know all the things I need to know yet to be a good like leader in social work. So I was kind of a artsy young person, and I thought like, well, you know, Portland would be a nice place to live because they do a lot of art stuff there, so I'll apply to go to school there. So that's how I ended up applying to the PhD program. And and I just like really wanted to live in Portland, and I applied to one school because I didn't know that people applied to more than one school, and they accepted me. So we moved up to Portland, and I was like, okay, cool. I wanted to be an educator at that point. I'm like, I've been a trainer in child welfare, and I would like to I'd like to maybe teach some college classes. That would be fun. And so that was kind of my main goal when I entered the PhD world. And I got there, and then they're like, oh, in your research class. And I was like, that's BS. I just really don't want to do research. I just want to, I want to know what it takes to be a teacher. And that's mostly about like how to run a class, right? And so punchline here, they don't tell you how to be a teacher in PhD programs. So that was a loss. But so I had a kind of a work study, a graduate research assistant, and I was working up at the research institute at the university, and they was like big tons of people who were all funded on grants and did like what I kind of consider ivory tower research, you know, that we collect a lot of data, then we do a lot of analysis and write a lot of papers, and then we apply for our next grant, you know. And in my mind, like having worked in child welfare settings and whatnot, like nobody is reading your research and then doing the things that your research tells you to. And if I'm going to do any research, it's going to be about improving practice. And so I was kind of bitter about this whole like we're going to make you do research thing still. And so I was, I guess, maybe in the middle of my second year where I just had like a PhD life crisis. Like we had a Catherine Kahn, who's my hero. She was on the faculty at the school, and she ran the child welfare research training center, and and she had come from child welfare practice as well. And I went to her and I said, I just don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I belong here. I don't want to spend my whole career doing research that doesn't make a difference in the lives of the people who we say that we're trying to help. And I was also really interested in the experience of child welfare practitioners because I had that experience personally, and I knew like it made such a huge difference to have a good supervisor. And so I was really interested in those organizational factors. And I said, well, this is what I want to know. I believe that to really have a good impact on families, you have to have a good organizational life yourself, and supervisors play a huge role in that. So I want to write about that thing. And so between tears and coffee, she introduced me to this idea of being a pracademic, like combining practitioner and academia life. And she said, oh, and you really can stay connected to the field and make a difference. And we really do care about the transfer between research and practice. Not everybody everywhere, but some of us in some places, and you can be that person. And let me tell you how I've done that. And so she kind of took me under her wing and hired me to come be a GRA at her center. And so that kind of changed my outlook. And I was like, okay, maybe I can do research that matters, and this is the road I'm on.
So first, I love the word pracademic, and I'm immediately stealing that because that seems so relevant. And then also it seems that she really stepped in at a moment when you needed some mentorship and some guidance. Were there other times when you really needed someone to mentor you and to point you in the right direction? And if so, how did that happen?
Yeah, for sure. Well, she is still a touchstone to me. And she, I think, really embodies that idea of being a pracademic. I just went to her Zoom retirement a couple months ago, and it was so lovely. There were like, I think 75 people in this Zoom room to celebrate her, and it was almost all like practitioners and agency leaders who she had impacted along the way by just like showing up as just this kind, warm, real person and help them think about their work. And then she also thought a lot about their work and learned a lot from those people. And so I would say that her mentorship just reached across all these boundaries of like, how do I show up with humility and learning and negotiate that role of being an expert and really appreciate and recognize other people's expertise? There are several people who have done that for me along the way. One of my mentors, I took my first job at the University of North Dakota, and the person who became the chair in that role was also just like so wonderful at thinking strategically, like just helping me think like, where do we want to go in this situation? And almost all research is relational. If you're doing community-based research, like the relationships are more important than the research in terms of getting access and gaining trust and really understanding what's going on with people. And like, you can't help change practice if you don't really understand, right? So she was another one of my mentors. Nancy Smith, the dean here at Buffalo. She has also been a great mentor to me. And then I've had just a lot of peer mentors too. Like, I know Jonathan Singer, who you've mentored or who you've interviewed, Laurel Iverson Hitchcock. One of the kind of funny, cool things is that I got on Twitter kind of early when social workers were getting on Twitter, and there were just kind of a few of us hanging out there who were pretty interested in the intersection of technology and social work. And Twitter has sort of this like democratizing quality. Like Nancy was on there. She's the dean of this R1, this like high research activity institution. And she's like, I could tell right away, she was smart. She cared about people. And so her and I were chatting, and then, and Jonathan Singer, who's also like a hotshot in his own like social work podcast kind of way. And we're chatting, and just, so as a junior faculty member, I had access to these people who I wouldn't have like natural access to, like even at the social work conferences, like the deans hang out in different social circles than the junior faculty from North Dakota, right? So Twitter is just like a really lovely place to gain connections and access to people. So this is how you and I met, right? Like being on Twitter there. So I would say that some great opportunities for mentorship came from there, and also just like watching other people, right? Because especially when I started this work, there are so few people interested in the intersection of social work and technology. Mm-hmm. And so, at some schools, you can like look to your left and you have a colleague who really gets what you're doing. But in my case, I didn't have that. And a lot of people were still kind of scoffing at like, oh, what's technology have to do with social work? That's not even a thing. And that's changed a little bit now, but I gained all kinds of opportunities to like co-write with people because of my Twitter relationships. And I had all kinds of people who said like, yeah, I'll help you figure that out. So yeah, that's really cool.
Now, you talked about child welfare but you really didn't say how you made the connection with technology. So how did that come about?
Yeah. Well, I've always been interested in technology, and I always considered that, like, well, child welfare was my research area and technology is my hobby. And like, so when I was in my undergrad social work program, I was the lab assistant for our lab department. I had federal work study. And so I taught people in, like, what was it, like maybe 1996, 7, how to make websites about social work. And at that time it was like GeoCities. And like, I remember I made a website because my husband was in the service. I made a website about deployment and deployment transitions for military spouses. And I remember I had like this cool GIF of like soldiers like marching, and then like women kicking their legs. It was like in like the whole glitter of GeoCities. It was a lot of fun. So, but it was kind of like, oh, like we can, like, we're social workers and we can build websites. So even when I moved into my PhD program, I said, well, if I'm going to pick an area, I'm interested in like technology kind of stuff and social work. And people were like, we don't have anybody who can mentor you in that area. And we really see that as like a business task, or like that's part of some other world. That's not really part of our world. And that was in about 2005. So even then, which is kind of funny, just 15 years ago, people were like, not really though, right? So they said, like, you really need to be in a core area that is well established if you want to get a job. And so I just kind of branded myself as a child welfare worker, interested in workforce issues and interested in disparities, that like how the outcomes are different between different kinds of families who end up in child welfare systems. And since I went to University of North Dakota, that was really the kind of work that I needed to focus on, because it was what my community needed. I was in a regional school. I was in a place where Indigenous people were very overrepresented in the child welfare system, and I wanted to kind of help them get to the heart of what that was about. So I did that. And then on the side, I kind of did like some surveys. I started asking some questions about, like, well, child welfare workers, what is your experience in using social media as part of your work? Where do you get guidance around that? And so I wrote a paper or two about that, but mostly I was writing about what we call the scholarship of teaching and learning. The University of North Dakota happened to be like one of the very first schools that used distance education. And because it's such a rural school, in a rural state, and kind of the only master's degree granting program, it was a really relevant topic there. When I came out here to the University at Buffalo in 2018, we're at a Research One institution, so people do research that's more kind of on a national stage versus like a local regional stage. And so I had an opportunity to shift my research to, like, if you want to talk about national impacts, what do you think is really important? And by that time, like, we'd moved along enough culturally, and technology was seen as a bigger and bigger role in the lives and intersections of other kinds of social work. So that's a really long answer to say, like, I had always been interested in technology, and it took a while to get to the place where I felt like I could really do research at the intersection of two things that were really important to me, the child welfare and technology.
It's a great answer, and I really resonate with the part about GeoCities. I think a lot of us started in the world of GeoCities, which was kind of fun. You kind of like left.
Yeah. For those of us who remember that, it was a little bit of a different world. This was the other reason that I was like inclined to think about technology, is like back during like AOL and Prodigy and all those days, I had started getting on the internet, and I was doing like message boards, and I met some really cool people that way. And so my orientation very early was like, oh, like technology can be really relational, and how do we make the most of that? And yeah, and so I guess in that way, that's still where I am, is thinking about like how do we make technology accessible for its good things and minimize the negative impacts, especially for like adolescents in foster care who have tons of relational losses and are also at increased risk online, but have the most to gain probably from being online.
And I think it's also probably important to start to have those conversations with students. So how do you convey that to students in that environment?
Yeah. That's certainly been part of my interest in like, how do we start on the ground floor talking to students because they're going to be the future leaders, and just by status of their like age or whatnot, older leaders are going to look to them and say, well, you understand this stuff, right? So normally, you know, in agencies, we see like the people who have been there a long time as experts in practice, and they're going to teach the young people or the new people how to behave in a social work world. But I see like this is just a little bit of a different space where people are going to say, well, this is technology, you do it, or you explain to us how this works, right? Because we have these like kind of silly notions that, that the young people know how to do it, which I definitely find is not true in my social work classes. Like you don't know how to do it just because you've had an email address longer than most people, you know? So I really started out doing a lot of presentations at conferences to teach other teachers about how I was incorporating some of this knowledge about technology in my classrooms and how we can be effective in using technology in our classrooms. And then, you know, eventually it led up to writing a book about social work and technology.
I'm looking for it because over here. Yeah, that's a really great book. Put in a plug for your book.
Yeah, it's called Teaching Social Work with Digital Technology, and it's mostly about effective use of teaching with technology, teaching online and things like that, or, you know, developing assignments that people can use online. Sometimes people think it's about practicing with technology, and it's not about that. That's really a different book. And we've thought about writing that sometimes. And I think now we're mostly thinking, oh, somebody else can write that book. So yeah, but it is like teaching online is a little bit of a different practice. Like you just can't take a regular in-person class and flip it online. You have to make some changes about how people interact with each other and how to give feedback and how to know if people are engaged. And we break up our time a little different because engagement is a little harder for long blocks of time online versus in the classroom. So you can't just like record a 90-minute lecture and put it online for people, right? Which is kind of the way a lot of people started. Like, oh, I talk for 90 minutes in the classroom and I ask questions, but since we can't ask questions asynchronously, I'll just talk for that full 90 minutes. And it doesn't play out well. So our book is mostly about how to make those changes to do more interactive online teaching, whether it's synchronous, like live online, or asynchronous, like self-paced online. So you were asking, like, how do I bring this to the classroom? So for one thing, like just really easy ways, like when we're talking about ethics and social work, you know, I try to build in those like ethical questions related to technology. So like say that you're called out, you're handed a case and a new client, and it turns out that you are friends with that person on social media, but you don't really talk to each other. You just happen to go to high school together and now you're friends on social media. How do you handle that? Right? And so it's kind of vague, like, oh, we're not really friends, but we're kind of friends. And what do you do even if you find out that you have a friend in common? And how do you decide whether you need to like search for them on social media at all to, you know, so those questions that are just more in this like I've never experienced this category. Maybe my social work supervisor has never experienced this or hasn't thought about it. One of the things that I learned in my early research when I started asking child welfare workers these kinds of questions is that people ran into these kinds of situations after like searching for their clients online, especially. And then they were like, oh, like I'm friends of a friend with this person, but now I realize maybe I shouldn't have been searching for them to start with. And so now I shouldn't tell anybody about it because maybe I did something bad, right? So they were in these spaces of like, oh, they should really seek supervision around this, but then because there's no agency policy or practice around it, and they had never had a conversation with their supervisor about social media ethical issues, it was just like, oh, I better keep my mouth shut kind of category. So it ends up being a really lost opportunity for supervision and mentorship. And we know that most ethical mistakes happen, not because somebody like chose to do something bad, but because like they didn't get supervision or have a conversation with somebody when they needed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many gray areas, and I'm glad that we're starting to have those types of conversations, and that there's some guidance, because yeah, like you said, there was no guidance before, so that's really
right,
good.
right.
Okay, so let's pivot back a little bit to research. And what would you say is your jam? Like, what's your favorite method? Quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods? Like, what is it that you tend to gravitate towards, or is there any one thing?
Yeah, no, I guess I'm one of those people who gets like really like irritated by the like, oh, what's your method kind of thing, because I really care about impacting practice, and therefore I feel like the method has to match the research question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if people want to know how many people are affected by this thing and which people are affected the most, then that probably leans more toward like quantitative survey methods, and that might even just be some just like really basic kind of information, descriptive statistics. And sometimes we go like, oh, that's just too simple. Sometimes that's really what agencies need, right? That's just like uncomplicated correlations, and that does the job. And sometimes we're trying to figure out like, well, what is really going on here? Like this group of people seem like really resistant to work with workers in this particular setting. What's going on with that? And so like qualitative methods might make more sense in that instance, because we don't know what the potential like multiple choice answers are. So I think mixed methods are good. I think as much as possible, we should match the methods to the questions.
Yeah, I like that answer. And I don't understand, and maybe you understand more than I do, because you've been doing this a lot longer than I have. But I've seen situations where people are publicly excoriated for using things like qualitative. And I don't understand, because the answer that I keep getting from people as I ask this is, you really have to match the method to what you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't understand why there's so much disregard for something that works so well to pull rich information out of people. So where do you think that comes from?
I think that there's a little bit of snobbery, especially like it's very common that people who are trained in the top research schools are trained in more complex statistical methods. So just by nature of like status, sometimes quantitative methods are taken more seriously. I think that one of the reasons people use quantitative methods versus qualitative is it's so much faster to do. But there's this like opposite kind of bias, like people who are trained in these more sophisticated quantitative methods sometimes say like, oh, you're only doing qual because you don't like math and you don't know how to do math, right? So I think that that's part of the status thing. I also think that a lot of people who do qualitative methods, like maybe don't do them rigorously, and that adds to the kind of the bias, like, well, that wasn't rigorous set of methods. And qualitative methods can be as rigorous as quantitative methods, right? If you go through kind of well-established processes, like whether you're doing like a thematic analysis or grounded theory, or, that there is a set of principles to use in all of these ways. And I think that sometimes people who haven't been well trained in qualitative methods just feel like, oh, like if you're doing qualitative, you just go and ask people questions and then sort out their answers based on your own bias. And I think that sometimes there's this stigma that qualitative work is more subject to interpretive bias, and
Mhm.
I just laugh and laugh because there are so many qualitative decisions that go into quantitative analysis, right?
Mhm.
Like which method do we use to figure out the answer? What questions do we use? What multiple choice answers do we pick? The quantitative methods are just flooded with qualitative process.
Mhm.
So as far as I'm concerned, all research is qualitative. That's my final answer.
Good answer. I like it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about data science, which, as you know, is one of my favorite things, and which can be used in all sorts of different methods. So, first, what is your opinion about data science? Like, what do you know about it, and how do you feel about using it in daily practice for social workers and possibly in research as well?
Yeah, maybe can you tell me what your definition of data science is, and I'll see if it matches mine.
Yeah, I got asked this last time too. So I think I have a couple of divergent definitions. One is strictly the method, right? So using it in a very specific way in a very specific environment. So, for example, learning something like uh, R programming or Python to do things like statistical methods and use it in a very specifically a very tight way for data analysis. Then the other thing that I have in my mind is something that's a lot broader and which I kind of think of as like social work data science. So using it in day-to-day life. So things like taking the data that you have and making it work for you and having the skills to do that in a way that is efficient and that makes sense. And the example that I use often is something like measurement-based care, which we collect tons and tons of information on that, but now what are you doing with it? So you can use it in a very small way with a patient, right? And look at how that looks over time. Or you can use it at a higher level. For example, this is how the whole clinic is performing. Everybody's scores are coming down. So everything that we're doing in the clinic is doing what we think that we're supposed to do. So now you should give us more funding because it works, right? So I think
Right.
those are the two ways that I think of data science.
Okay, that's helpful because we're talking about this in a lot of different ways today.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we're flooded with so much data, and I
Mm-hmm.
think there's more and more pressure to figure out how to use the data to improve practice, which,
Mm-hmm.
like, of course we should, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember in my bachelor's program, we learned single subject design and how to kind of track client outcomes over time and like kind of pre-test, post-test methods to look at like just individual client change. We used goal attainment scaling. Do you remember that? Have you ever learned that? Just kind of measuring client, it's just a single subject method. But never in my practice was I ever asked to do any kind of single subject design with clients or to look at their progress in any quantitative way. And I've worked in a lot of settings, psychiatric care with both adults and children. And I worked at the VA, at the Housing and Urban Development kind of housing first programs, and in child welfare, of course. And like I said, we just never really looked in any structured way at data. Like maybe we looked like how many sessions or no shows, or how many past allegations has this person has had, or have there been past removals? And there's some assumptions that play into like how you use that information, but never very structured. Sometimes like in child welfare, we got like monthly printout case reports, like this many of your visit notes are overdue, right? But, so I think that maybe when I was in practice, we were just starting to emerge related to like, okay, we're able to make some reports of things that have happened, and maybe you can make some interpretations of that to assess your own practice. Maybe your supervisor would talk to you about it. I think that's shifting, and I haven't worked in practice really recently, so I don't have a good answer about whether things like that are happening very differently, but my sense is probably not. I'm working with computer scientists right now in my work, and part of what we're doing is we're looking at the use of algorithms for making predictive decisions about what happens in child welfare. And on the surface, it seems so smart. Like We can use these algorithms to help us predict what might happen next in a particular case, and then maybe make some preventative decisions about how to avoid a bad outcome. And so this has been done in child welfare in some settings with a major goal typically of trying to prevent a harmful outcome for a child. Like, here's a child who, based on their like demographics and other factors, is pretty likely to end up in foster care. And maybe we need to take a more assertive approach to dealing with that case, because this is a child who's likely to be at high risk, right? And there are some complicated things about that, because algorithms, when you use historical data, just tell you what other people, human people, have done, and human people are biased. And in some ways, the kind of the math and algorithms can actually overemphasize some kinds of bad outcomes when those outcomes are happening to a small group of people. And the really bad outcomes do happen to a pretty small group of people. So it's like complicated on multiple levels. So when I started this work with computer scientists as sort of the content expert, I had been in conversation with another junior faculty in computer science, and we were talking about how we might collaborate. And I said, well, like, let's flip this on its head a little. It will be much less controversial to talk about like what older foster youth in care are likely to have poor outcomes, and we can predict what service needs they have, right? And people, like, this won't be seen as controversial because, like, the worst we do is accidentally give somebody a service they don't need. It sounds like it has potential for less harm. But we were specifically working on a project funded by the National Science Foundation and Amazon, of all people, to they gave us some money to try to figure out, like, how do we deal with the embedded bias in the data, and how do we make sure that the bias doesn't fuel what kind of decisions we make. And as we started digging into this question, like, the problems just seemed more and more and more complicated. Like, oh, actually, though, like, if we have a system that has favored services for white males, for instance, we're going to have predictions that also favor that service delivery works the best for white males because they've just been given more opportunities to benefit from that service. Or we may potentially say, like, oh, like how homelessness prevention services don't work well for Black males. They just end up in jail anyway. And so therefore, that's like a wasted service if we give them that service, right? And without, like, the algorithm doesn't understand that, like that Black males are more often to be just watched by police, and they're more likely to live in communities where there's over surveillance, and all that plays into their outcomes, and their outcomes may not be as linked to the services they get. And we should really be dealing with these system issues versus like what service we give them. And then so, like, this felt very complicated. And I'm like, I just like sometimes crumble back to like, oh my gosh, our system is so broken. What do we do? There's nothing we can do. We're a mess, you know? And so I guess that's the, like, part of the complication of research, right? Like, where do we start? If we really go back to the root sources, I say the root sources of everything are capitalism, right? And we're not likely to turn over that rock. And so what do we do in the meantime? So we are still trying to work out these problems now. As we've moved a little further along into working with this data, we're thinking more about, like, what are the system structures that predict the outcomes for kids versus, like, how do I give the caseworker an idea about what preventative service to offer? We're going like, oh, this cluster of kids, because they're so much less likely to be reunified in their with their families of origin, like, head down a path of worse outcomes, and let's try to fix what happens when they come into care. And then, yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking that in my mind, I usually think of research and outcomes pointing forward, right? So the answer that you get points you to the next thing in the future. But as you're talking, it occurs to me that what's happening is sometimes it really points you backwards. Like, this is what's been happening. So how do we go back and correct that?
Yeah, and I'm sure that you're also thinking about how complicated this gets, because if you have like a vet with PTSD in front of you, you know, like, okay, well, that vet came from like a combination of that vet's life experiences and the like their personal life experiences and the military trauma that they've experienced. And so if you're thinking about how do we correct that, like on one hand, like what does that mean about what service we should give now and how to prevent like the outcomes becoming even worse? And on the other hand, like, well, like, but maybe we should cancel the military and deal with childhood trauma. So I guess that's the complicated thing. The more data we have, that it starts pointing you in all these directions. And there is kind of this challenge of where do we start, especially from a social work lens, where is it most just to start working on the issue? And so many of the issues we deal with are systems, and it's a lot harder to change systems than it is to support a person. And I guess there's like a lot of controversy, and even like it's come up between me and my colleagues, like who are more like macro focused. I would say that I'm very practical when it comes to research, and like we're not demolishing the child welfare system tomorrow, so that can't be the answer. And there are kids that need help right now, so how do we do something for them right now? And some of the people I work with are just like, no, wait, like deconstruct the child welfare system because that's the most wrong. And I'm like, but kids right now. And so it is. It's part of our job in research is to make these like qualitative calls about like, where do we start? Where can we do some good? For me, it's like, where can we do some good the soonest for people who need it right now? I think that that's my very like practitioner experience lens that says like people need support right now, and there is this pool, like how do we fix systems so that kids who are working through the system are less likely to experience be traumatized by the systems themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking particularly about military sexual trauma, which I've worked in for a long time, and really that is one of those forwards backwards questions, right? So how do we stop that from happening? And really the way to do that is to really dismantle a lot of the practices that make that okay, right? That make that acceptable.
Right, exactly.
Those are things that happened in the past. So you're really trying to do, really, it seems like you're working on a timeline that stretches into the past and the future. So I'm thinking that maybe one of the ways to do that is to get more boots on the ground, right? So with social workers. So that we
get more people interested.
So oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say really quickly that I think a nice way of breaking this down, my dean tells this story of like, you know, that there's this problem in the city. It's a longer story, but I'm going to tell a short version, that kids keep floating downriver. And so an intervention is designed to pull the kids out of the river. And then finally somebody goes like, oh, maybe we should go upriver and find out who's throwing the kids in the river, right? And so like, okay, but like, while we're figuring that out, do we let the kids drown in the river? Like, yeah. So if we have people upstream and downstream, that's the ideal world.
Hi, who's barking? Who's barking?
Those are my babies. I have a golden doodle and a Labrador, and they like they're like one of those alarm systems. Like one goes off, then the other goes off. Yeah,
that's the best kind of alarm system. But it's sleeping quietly at the moment, so fingers crossed. Because Amazon could come in any moment and then everything's gonna break loose. So getting more people at more stages along the river definitely would be helpful. So do you see usefulness in having more direct practice social workers? And I struggle with that term because I know people, there are different ways to say that, but do you see more usefulness in getting more direct practice social workers involved? Or we're calling them academics now, right?
Yeah, of course, because you know, we're thinking right away, I think like maybe a critical lens about research, like almost when we read research that says you should do this, we go like, that won't work here because ... my people are especially different because you know, and like, oh well, that would never work here because we don't have the kind of access, and oh well, the people in that study like they were in a 30-day inpatient program and we don't provide any inpatient or intensive outpatient, it doesn't match up, right? And so we need academics both to help translate like, well, what parts of that would work in our agency and does that make sense for our populations? And we need practitioners to help us ask better questions, right? Because they work with people all day and they know like the real struggles and can help us think about research that addresses the challenges that they experience in practice. And we need social work leaders who can help us think about the organizational factors in organizations that make it hard to move an evidence-based practice to the field. Implementation science is really emerging now in connection to research, and this comes from the whole study of how difficult it is to move evidence-based practice to practice settings. And so there, like, this whole new area of science has been developed just to help move back and forth between practice and research. And one of the statistics that I hear coming from implementation science is that it takes on average between like 7 and 14 years for a well established evidence-based practice to make it into a practice setting. And even then, only about 30% of well-established research practices make it to that practice setting. So it just, like, when you think about that, like, oh, like most research we do is just like pointless because it never gets used in practice, that's a really big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And practitioners can help us kind of manage that translation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm hoping to bring a lot more people around to social work practice research, which really gets everybody involved in that process and at least theoretically cuts that timeline down. So hopefully we'll see more people moving in that direction in the future.
Yeah. And I think that, like I said, like this conflict I had about, like, do I want to be a researcher? Like, I hate statistics. Like, I don't enjoy doing math. Those were my first thoughts when somebody said, like, well, when I figured out, like, you have to do research to get a PhD, you think somebody would have told me that. Like I said, I didn't have any exposure to people with PhDs before I was admitted into the program. And maybe for the best, because I probably wouldn't have gone down that path. But it's just so much more meaningful when you situate it in the kind of work that you care about, right? Like we're not just numbers and statistics when we're talking about our programs and our people and how to make life better for them. Like, then we're invested. And then, like, the statistics part of it becomes, like, actually smaller and smaller. Like, the most important things in research are not the math. They're like, how do we ask good questions? How do we get this back into the field? How do we take findings and make them work? And actually, most people who do research hire out the statistics part of it to somebody else, or they have a colleague who helps them with the stats person. And, like, so people whose main thrust of research is one area or another, they're really focused on the, like, either the social dynamics of that problem. They're not focused on the math, you know. So we have to, like, disassociate that, like, research is math. Research is really about, like, thinking about a problem and how we figure out the answers to it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. So do you think there's enough diversity in research in general or in social work research? And if it's an issue, how do we start to change it?
No, it's one of those really complicated problems, right? Because research, in part, I mean, is associated with higher education and all those things. And we have all kinds of gatekeeping processes, social and professional, that keep some people out and let some people in to these worlds. And, you know, people who don't have mentors or who are underexposed to the opportunities, of course, are less likely to go down those paths. But then, like, we also have, like, tons of organizational processes that let some people in and let some people out, starting from, like I say, it all goes back to capitalism, but like the way taxes are collected in communities to fund schools, right? So if kids who are in the very well-off communities have a better tax base to improve their schools, then they're going to get a lot more exposure to kids who are in poorer socioeconomic neighborhoods who don't have as strong of a tax base to bring in like experts and mentors and exciting curriculum that motivates them towards those outcomes. So yeah, it's complicated. And not to mention the bias that feeds all part of the systems. And, you know, there's plenty of literature on like the both microaggressions and big aggressions that people of color face as they work, try to work within research systems. And we go back to the core of all of our social work research theories. Almost all comes from white men and doesn't fit every place. And then, you know, people are very likely to answer research questions that they're personally connected to in some way, right? Like, so I worked in child welfare. I understood my own position of really needing like good leadership to sustain me in practice. And so I went on to study that problem. And so, so if people kind of study problems in their area of experience and interest, and we don't have diversity in the field that helps us expand the way that we think about research problems and questions, of course we're going to be limited in the kinds of problems we address and the way we think about them.
Yeah, I'm also thinking of, you know, other types of diversity. One of the things about the art community is that it's really opened my mind up to really making all these types of things accessible to people. So even if you think about things like disability, and I'd never really thought about this before, there are programs like LaTeX that allow you to write mathematical symbols, because you can't do that in other types of word processing programs. But if you think about it, then there are also these the compilers and so forth that you use to write code. A lot of them really, they can't have interaction with somebody who has limited vision, right? And have a friend who's working on that problem. So it really, there are so many things that limit what people are allowed to do. And most of us who have all of our faculties and, you know, we can see and we can hear, and we don't really think about those things because they don't apply to us either, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we open all of those things up to more people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also think that like that kind of like R and some of the newer ways, like the algorithm kind of methods have not yet made it to social work broadly yet. And so people are less likely to get exposure to that in their programs, maybe more so than like, of course, a computer science program or probably even a psychology program, you know, and so we are kind of slow to the boat, which of course limits who can use those kinds of methods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking faculties is probably the wrong word, so I'm gonna have to work on myself later. Okay, so what type of advice, finally, would you give to direct practice social workers who are trying to get more experience or just to get their foot in the door to become researchers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So people at universities are always looking for practice collaborators, and sometimes they're actually hard to find. Very often the research begins with the researcher going and approaching somebody at the agency and trying to gain access and trying to develop relationships, and it's a real gift if a practitioner shows up and says like, hey, we're struggling with this thing at our agency. I thought maybe you could help, right? Like, so I would say don't be intimidated by researchers who are just humans, and you know a lot more about practice than they do, and they know some things maybe about asking a question, and they could help you think about how to do that. And folks are always looking for those kinds of collaborations. You know, I think that it's often best to look at a local university in your community, but sometimes nationally if your question is really specific, right? Because there are people who specialize in sexual trauma related to the military, and you might not find that at your local university. You might have to go national to ask that kind of question. There are these groups of people who are really interested in practice to research kind of problems, and they usually have like centers. Like in almost every area, there's a child welfare training center, and they are kind of at the intersection of research and practice, and so those are good places to make connections. But there are also all kinds of institutes nationally that specialize in a number of different kinds of things, from military trauma to substance abuse disorders to, you know, all the things. So, so if you have kind of niche areas of interest, those are good places to check in and to just say like, hey, I'm a practitioner in this area. How do I get involved in research? If you just broadly want research experience. But it's great when you're like taking actual, like, we're struggling with this thing in this area kinds of issues, and like, now I have some ideas about what's happening, and I would like to figure out whether that's really what's going on or there's something else. One of the biggest issues for researchers is getting access to local data. There are like all kinds of barriers to gaining access. So practitioners can help ease the way through their kind of connections and what they know about how the systems work and who to talk to and all those things. And so again, that's a real gift to researchers. They like, practitioners should not see themselves as burdens or hassles when it comes to doing that kind of outreach, because a lot of times people will see that as like a real gift to them to have the opportunity to make some real difference in practice. And I would say if you reach out to one person and hit a wall, ask them like, either like, are there other people that you think would be really interested in this area who I could contact? Or, you know, if they're just not responding to you or whatnot, move on and ask somebody else. And I would also say, don't feel like stuck related to talking to social workers. Like, of course, I say social work is a great place to start, and social workers maybe think a little more about the research and practice connection than some other professions. But, you know, it might be a question well suited to a psychologist or a computer scientist or an economist. I love Google Scholar because it will give you lists of places that are accessible even if you're kind of paywalled and locked out of research. But scholar.google.com, put in some of the things related to your problem in there, and you can look and see who's writing about it. And sometimes that's a great place to start. You know, the like, who is the author here? You can click that author's name and Google them and see what they're up to and where they are. And that might be a good place to start reaching out to ask questions, because they are already in that area and probably at least have good leads for you. And I would also say, like, when you look at your university websites, there's often a section about personnel that that says who is like tenured or tenure track faculty, and people who have assistants in front of their names, they're often like under a lot of pressure to get some writing done and to get some data access and to move a research question forward. And like, it's good to talk to people who are hungry, right? So those are great people to reach out to too.
Excellent advice. That's really valuable. Thank you. So we're going to wrap up soon, but is there anything that maybe we've left out or that you really feel that you would like to address or put out there before we go?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I would just say, like, claim your space and your expertise. Like the imposter syndrome stuff is real. Like, we all feel like we don't know enough. Like, I hope researchers never stop feeling that way. I know I've met some of them who feel like they know everything already, but mostly, you know, if you read any research paper, at the end of it, it says like, here are future directions, because we don't know all this stuff yet, right? And so we all know that we have more to know, and practitioners, you know, bring all kinds of knowledge that we don't have as researchers. And the relationships really can be symbiotic. I would say, like, put your self-flagellation aside, or that kind of like, I'm not worthy thing. Like, we're all just humans trying to do a thing. Hopefully we're trying to do a thing that makes the world a better place and makes life better for our clients. And if we can connect on that ground and like do the let's figure it out together kind of thing, it can be really exciting, right? One of the things that's been most exciting to me to work with computer scientists is I feel like I'm back in school, and I know things like I had like serious like imposter syndrome when I started working with them. I'm like, oh, I just have a social work degree, and what am I going to have to bring to these people who know all these like fancy math things? and you know, and so like we got together, and some of the assumptions they made were just like super ridiculous. like they're like and like they're like, well, like like, let's separate the variables open to bias from those who that aren't. So like, of course, like age and race and those kinds of things are going to be things that aren't open to bias at all, right? And I'm like, wait a minute, how do we figure out what somebody's race is? Like, let me tell you how it works. And they're like, oh, mind blown. Like, we didn't think that there was any bias when it comes to like what race somebody is in the computer system. So just like very simple things like that, where social workers, practitioners have like really lived experience in how that data is generated. It's super important. And like, as we're writing, I said, well, you know, we'll use ecosystems theory as kind of a base model for talking about this. And they're like, ecosystems, what is that? Tell me more. That sounds really interesting. And I'm like, duh, like, have you ever taken a science class? But, you know, certain things have been pounded so much into our training, and that we forget that they're even a thing that other people don't know. And so I guess my advice is just never underestimate your wisdom, what you have to bring to research, and how much better the research will end up and translate to practice if you are involved.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for spending this time talking about research. I really appreciate that you did this, and I hope you have a great semester.
Fabulous. I think this will be a great resource for folks. So thank you for all your work and investment in getting this done.
Of course. I love doing it. So thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.